Okay, so now that we've got our data file in Excel, we're going to talk about how we clean up our data and put it in a format that's usable for SPSS. So first of all, let's take a look at this data set just to orient ourselves a little bit more. Once again, the questions are up here. This asks an overall question followed by individual items. These particular pieces of information, whether somebody clicked that they agreed, everyone had to do that, and then their experimenter number, those things are not needed for analysis, and neither is the start date and end date and the respondent information. This is also where the participant email is going to be if you use the email tracker. So we don't want that. We want to delete the unnecessary information, which is usually going to be in this particular section. This is the information we want. So here we have participant gender, here we have age, here we have 4 different questions that deal with extroversion, and here we have 4 different questions that deal with conscientiousness, and here we have 6 questions that deal with optimism. And then we move into the health behaviors. How often do you do these things? And then it asks a series of open-ended responses. For example, over the past year, how many times have you attempted to follow a diet of some sort, etc. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So first of all, we have a categorical variable here with gender, and this was an open-ended question. And you can see that people put down male or female, but sometimes they put down M, and sometimes they put down lowercase male or female. And so we want to code this in a way that SPSS will recognize. What SPSS loves is numbers, and I'm going to show you how to properly label those numbers in just a little bit. Now, the numbers you use are arbitrary. It doesn't matter whether females are assigned 1 or males are assigned 1, but come up with some sort of system that works for you and then label it. You can use find and replace, or you can just go through manually. Let's go ahead and say that females are 1 and males are 2. How you go through and label the entire thing. I'm just going to do this first part to illustrate it. But this would be how you'd set it up so that it copies and pastes easily over into SPSS. Because once again, SPSS would treat uppercase male, M, and lowercase male as separate categories. You don't want that. The rest of this is all equal interval levels. So we don't have to label those different groups at all. We're just going to copy and paste the raw data in. It's important to know the range of the scales, and you can look at that in the original data and questionnaire to make it, to figure it out. I can also quickly eyeball this. This looks like a 5-point scale, for example. It's really easy for me to tell the range just by taking a look at all these different numbers. So these are all equal interval level numbers, so I'm going to treat those differently than my category numbers. And there's some extra cleaning that has to be done. So over here, we have some open-ended responses. You can see most people put down numbers, but some people put down things like 3 or 4, or they wrote out none, or they might have written out like 5, right? So if you ask an open-ended response, you need to clean this data up so that it becomes just a number with no English and a single number so that SPSS doesn't freak out and it knows how to handle it. So come up with consistent rules. For example, if this is 3 or 4, I would put the number that falls in between. If it's none, I would put 0. I'm on 1, put 1. 14 to 16, once again, pick the number that's in the middle, pick the number that's in the middle, and so on. You have to go through and clean this up a little bit, and then come up with a decision. So if something is never, that's very easy, right? If something is a few or many, that's a little too vague. So I'd say if they provide something like this in an open-ended question, that's a non-response and it doesn't get counted. I would delete that, so there's nothing there. You can see how you clean up this data in order to make it transferable so that all of these are numbers and that it represents single numbers and there's no English. Once again, so SPSS can handle it a lot better. Now that we've cleaned up our data and labeled our categories, the next stage is to go ahead and create an SPSS data file. So the SPSS data file itself has has two different views, data view and variable view. I'm going to go through variable view and put the different variables in that I'm going to copy and paste. So for example, we have gender, age, we have extroversion, there's 4 different items. I like to label the subscales very clearly so I know what I'm working with, rather than calling it variable 1 or variable 2. Remember, SPSS doesn't like spaces. All right, and then the first behavior question is, how often do you eat a healthy, balanced meal? So I'm just going to call that one balance. And this is just what I'm going to be working with for illustrations for this particular set of data, right? So another thing I'm going to do is when I have a category, I'm going to make sure to identify it by values. This is so very important. I can't overemphasize this enough. If you call something 1s and 2s, make sure you label what the 1 is and what the 2 is if it's a category. You don't have to do that at all for the rest of these variables because they're equal interval, so you don't have to label each individual data point. In fact, I'd strongly recommend against that. You're just dealing with the raw numbers and you're calculating means and things like that. But if it's a category, make sure that you label it and label it clearly so that it'll help remind you of this later. Another thing that you can do is make use of the label category here to provide the extra information about the scales. So for example, I don't need extra information for age, that's fairly self-explanatory, but for these 4 extroversion scales, I need information about what the questions were so that I can go back through and figure out which ones were reverse worded and how to deal with them properly. So what I'd recommend that you do is that you literally go through and copy and paste the individual items into the labels. Have the full item wording right there in your data file and can properly track the different items and what they're measuring. We're going to be working with this in just a little when we do reverse wording and how to calculate that in another video. You can see here's the first conscientiousness item, and so on. So you can see how you'd work to put the different items there so you can track them. Finish up conscientiousness. But I would do this for the rest of these too. And once again, if you have items like 4 different items in extroversion, put all 4 of them there just to kind of keep track of these different items, right? Once you have your variables set up, you can go into data view and you can copy and paste. Now, I have much more data than what I'm showing in this window, but I'm going to copy and paste just what's in this window to show you. I would recommend you do it all in one lump. I'm going to treat this as if I had 21 participants. So don't pay attention to the fact that there's more than 21 here. If you do it, you would want to do it all in one go. So I'm going to go ahead and do my first 21, and I'm just going to do the ones I have variables for right now. So that's through how often do you eat a healthy, balanced meal. You might notice not everybody's filled out everything. That's fine. Don't worry about it. Once again, you can imagine you'd be doing this for your entire data set after it's all clean, not just in pieces and chunks, but this is just for purposes of illustration. I would literally copy it. See how it shows up. I have my different variables. I have my participants. This is actually 19 participants because the top 2 rows are already taken by questions, so it's 19 people instead of 21. Sorry if that's see how you copy and paste your data over. And once again, I'd recommend you do your entire data set all in one go rather than doing it piecemeal to make it easy and straightforward. The last little bit I'm going to cover in this video, I know it's already a little long, but I'm going to talk through the different conditions when you have experiments. So I'm going to show you the data file from the mini labs project that we did, just to kind of show you a little bit more about what it looks like when you assign people so that they receive, half of them receive one question and half of them receive another. So in this particular case, this is an example of the anchoring, just because it's something we're all familiar with. And you can see how sometimes they were asked the distance from San Francisco to New York City is shorter than 6,000 miles. And sometimes they were asked the distance from San Francisco to New York City is longer than 1,500 miles. So you can see how some people were assigned one question and some people were assigned another. This is their answer to the question, but this is the condition they were in. So in this particular case, this would be the high anchor, and this would be the low anchor. Can everyone see that, hopefully? And once again, this is their answer to the question itself. You can see how they had to do a lot of cleaning up for this data because it was all open-ended responses. This weird. Let me just fiddle with something. All right. So if I was dealing with this, I'd deal with it in the same way that I dealt with gender earlier. Or what I would do is I'd come up with numbers. So I would say, for example, I want the high one to be a 2 and the low one to be a 1. And then what I would do is I would make sure to have the question easily available so I could see it. And then I would put a 2 for the high and a 1 for the low. And then when I copied and pasted it over into SPSS, create a new data file. Once again, very similarly to gender, I would go ahead and have San Fran anchor, something that makes sense to me intuitively, and then I'd label it in the values, 1 low, 2 high, and then I would copy this over into my SPSS. And that would help me analyze this data later in the form of, say, a t-test, where I'd want to test the differences between the high and low anchoring groups. So you can see how I'd treat it if I ask 2 different questions and randomly assign 50% of people to one and 50% of people to another. Here's how you can figure out which question they were asked and then assign them different things as categories. And once again, treat them very similarly to how you treat gender. So that's how we get our file set up.